On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Foundation for the Carolinas, inspiring philanthropy and empowering individuals to create a better community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte-Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
So I think it's about knowing your gifts and knowing what you're good at. I've served on the boards of organizations, I've been practitioners inside of organizations, and I serve the nonprofit community best as a consultant, meaning that the change I can make, the strength I can bring, the perspective, and frankly, the position as a third-party facilitator and thinker is best suited to who I am. Now, I also feel that there is something missing. And that's part of my journey with the mission of Next Stage is how can I do this work in a way that is most closely aligned with the idea of having a mission, the idea that I'm more than the sum of the parts. There's an outcome I'm trying to work toward. So that's been a big journey. That's been the 10 years of this work has been how to do it in a way that's authentic and true to who I am.
Josh Jacobson is managing partner of Next Stage, a firm that provides strategic counsel to nonprofit organizations. Next Stage helps nonprofits develop the platform and tools necessary to support operations and fundraising activities. Josh has worked across nonprofit sectors, offering strategic planning, volunteer development, annual and capital fundraising, executive and development search, case strategy, and succession planning. Before launching Next Stage, Josh served as a Senior Resource Development Director with Manhattan Theater Club on Broadway, and as a Senior Officer at the Juilliard School. He is a Certified Fundraising Executive and 2018 Board President of the Charlotte Chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. In this episode, we explore helping nonprofit organizations realize their vision and mission, discerning a life journey, and what craft beer and community have in common. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Josh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark.
How do you describe Next Stage?
Next Stage is a firm that works with nonprofit organizations in organizational development and fund development. On the organizational development side, we're focused on strategic planning, strategic business planning, and human resources. How does a nonprofit engage its staff and board in pursuit of mission? On the fund development side, it's all resource-driven and financial resources. How does a development plan help to fuel that nonprofit mission?
How do you go about that work?
Well, in a lot of different ways. And we try to right size to the organization and its needs. So we often will work in multi-month engagements that are focused on a discovery period where we have a chance to look into the kind of primary research, the voices of stakeholders, as well as secondary research, trend research, data gathering towards the development of a current conditions assessment. That's a jumping off point for a planning phase. That's the second phase of work. And typically we come out on the other end with a strong roadmap into the future. So whether that's looking comprehensively at the organization or narrowed into one aspect of the organization's operations.
How does that happen, Josh? If I was an executive of a nonprofit and I retained you, what would you do? What would happen in our engagement?
Sure. Well, you know your organization best. So it begins with understanding your perspective as the founder or the executive director or the board chair. It's kind of interesting who brings you into that engagement. Sometimes it's the board that's inquisitive about the direction the organization's going. Sometimes it's the executive director who may be frustrated by the board and their lack of engagement or assistance. Sometimes it's a funder who's interested in understanding how to help that organization get to the next level. So it all depends on who and how you're brought into the organization. But first we have to understand kind of what are the perceptions, what are the working theories that the organization has at present. And then the benefit really of external counsel is the third party perspective. So being able to go out and talk to stakeholders, that's a term we use. Stakeholders are really anyone who has an active stake in the organization. That could be a volunteer or a donor. But really, we're all stakeholders in these nonprofits. They're all publicly held entities. So we really take a broad view. We sometimes call them prospective stakeholders if someone doesn't have a clear and direct line to the organization. But we go and test these working theories and ideas, and we bring our own working theories into the mix. And really, it's the give and take between what the organization knows about itself and what it thinks about itself, and with how the community perceives the organization and its ambition.
Why work with nonprofits and not with for-profit companies?
Great question. More than one morning, I've asked myself the same question. Well, I believe so strongly in the nonprofit structure. It's been somewhat baked into my experience. I've long worked either inside or alongside nonprofits. It's such a unique American institution, this idea that we would have a public entity that is owned by all of us. It's actually like government. It's a public entity, and a board of directors of volunteers, unpaid most of the time. Individuals are drafted from all people to manage this public asset on our behalf, and then a staff is hired in order to do the work. It's complicated and messy, but also beautiful if you believe in kind of the wisdom of the crowd, and that all of the constituents and stakeholders in the organization help to form a basis and a driving forward that helps make social good possible. A for-profit is owned by one person or a set of people, and it's very difficult to have a stake in an organization that you don't actually own. So if we're going to conquer and make inroads on the things that challenge us as a community, we really need collective ownership over making that possible, and nonprofits are our best model to make that possible.
In simple terms, what does your business promise?
Promise is a challenging word. Promise is a difficult word when you're starting off with an organization and don't know what you're going to encounter. As I described earlier, the challenges of the nonprofit model are frankly that there are so many moving gears. So what we can promise is that we are earnest facilitators of a process that will bear out clarity and a roadmap moving forward. Both of those, I think, are hallmarks of the work that we do. What that looks like, what challenges we might encounter as we work with that organization, the issues and the cliff that might be out in the future that is, as of yet, not verbalized by the organization, we can't know on the front end. So it's hard to promise, and often organizations want some level of promise. Can you promise me that we'll raise more money? Can you promise me that we'll find more board members? Can you promise me that we will be better off having invested in this organization? And the tough answer there is what might come out of it is that your mission and organization are not in alignment with the community, that there is low perception of the value proposition that your organization brings forward, that there is discord between the staff and board that is not something that can be overcome. To learn those things is clarity. To learn those things is a way forward, and there may be a plan that will develop, but an organization has to be open to the process, and we're very upfront about that. We've gotten much better at describing that on the front end too. And one nice thing about Next Stage, I think, in this community is that we're, I think, understood as good stewards of that process. So we're not, I think, having to put forward a sales proposition on the front end that doesn't become true. In fact, we often are much more upfront about the challenges often of what engaging a firm like ours may bear.
Josh, on your website, you pose this question to nonprofits. Quote, can you express where you are going and what you will accomplish? Why do you think being able to express a vision is so hard?
Well, I'm a huge believer in founders, particularly founders of nonprofit organizations. I believe that vision is the value proposition with a community that builds inspiration, that leads to buy-in. Part of the challenge, I think, for that founder is all the baggage that comes with having founded that nonprofit almost as soon as the 501c3 is granted. So while one may go into it with a clear picture in their head of the good that they'd like to do or the impact that they'd like to have, they're immediately beset with the challenges of organizational management. I need a board of directors. I need a calendar of activity. I need to be out fundraising. No, I need to be doing my mission. No, I need to be building relationships with partners. There's so much work and tactical work that gets kind of poured on the founder that initial flame that burns so brightly that caused the person to want to go after it in the first place begins to become muted. And many voices begin to inform that founder of the realities of the world around them. I would argue that not always as informed voices. So just because you have an opinion doesn't mean that you necessarily have the right opinion. I think in engaging a firm like ours and me as a consultant, you're gaining the benefit of the 200 or so nonprofit organizations I've worked with, the many founders that I've come alongside. And in effect, you're getting the benefit of the wisdom of having seen so many organizations at various stages of growth. So in that way, I think helping the organizational founder achieve clarity by pushing aside the things that are near-term barriers to look to the future. I also see a difference between enduring vision and time-limited vision. So enduring vision, I tend to use the example of a homeless shelter. So in a homeless shelter, the long-term enduring vision would be to eradicate homelessness. And our mission is to serve the next homeless individual who comes through the door. So we have a mission that's very specific and right in front of us, and we have an enduring vision that is way off in the future, almost idyllic, and not very much in between. And so we often will work with organizations around what's a time-limited vision? Can you give me an idea of what the next 10 years may look like? With the idea that 10 years is a far enough horizon that I'm willing to be more ambitious than if I said, what will you do in the next year or the next 3 years? 10 years feels far enough off that I may be willing to crank it up a little bit in terms of how ambitious I'm willing to be. There's what you know you can do, there's what you think you can do, and then there's what you hope you can do. We really have to move organizations into expressing what they hope they can do, because only by inspiring people will they come alongside them. The founder the 7-year itch is often 7 years in the organization, the founder is exhausted. They've exhausted their network around them. They're at a important tipping point. They either get to the next level or it doesn't go anywhere. We've worked with a lot of organizations in that space. And often it comes down to, can you articulate what you need a group of people to come alongside you to accomplish? And when we get that clarity, the founder usually has that deep down inside them. It's hidden because it's now been protected. It's been wrapped up because of all the good advice they've received and all the people that are telling them about what they should do and the tactics they need to be implementing. And it allows them to unveil again what got them maybe to start that organization in the first place.
What do more founders of nonprofit organizations need to know?
Well, the first would be how many nonprofits there are. I'm surprised often by how little founders of nonprofits do in the form of market research before establishing their nonprofit. The IRS is not a very good arbiter of the nonprofit founding. So if you fill out your paperwork and describe and file that all successfully, you're going to be issued that 501c3. So there's no great accomplishment in being issued a 501c3. It means you probably had an attorney or a number 2 pencil. So knowing that we have some 4,000 charitable organizations in Mecklenburg County should be a moment to pause. particularly if in what you're founding and the nonprofit that you're establishing already exists in some form, or that there are organizations already working in the space. So we really believe in this idea of a continuum of nonprofits that are serving our community, and the founders are really important, but not a founder who is uninformed. So I would want any founder, anyone thinking about starting a nonprofit, to first do their due diligence. What other organizations are there in Charlotte doing the work that I want to do? What are the trends and the demographic shifts that are happening in our community that may inform the future of my mission as an organization? Is there a larger organization that I could be a vendor or tethered to in some way that would help me not just go it alone, but actually be maybe an outreach of a larger organization? And there's a lot of kind of pushback on the founder to, why don't you just do that under the auspices of another organization? And the reality is those organizations aren't necessarily open for business, looking for founders that want to come and be a programmatic component. But I would just want someone to have a really good business plan starting off that says, here's the value I add, here's the niche I'm looking to serve in this community, here's how I partner with other organizations, here's how I'm going to develop the revenue I need to be successful, here's where the board is going to come from. So a far more informed founder who understands they're up against lots of other organizations in this community, and particularly resource development, would be my number one goal in talking to anybody who's looking to start a nonprofit.
Josh, you recently went through a rebranding and dropped the word consulting from the name of your business. Why?
The word consulting has always been a challenging one. I don't know that I see myself as a consultant, really. I think my mind's eye still sees myself as the nonprofit staff member who was trying to do good in the community. I do love the work that I do and believe that it's a important and necessary component to nonprofit life in Charlotte and beyond. The discernment came from what I'd call my second 10,000 hours. So my first 10,000 hours were focused on understanding what it was to do this work, how to move out of the nonprofit sector and into a for-profit consulting firm that works with the nonprofit sector. So how to do that work. What does it look like? Knowing myself and where are my gifts in coming into that community in that way. But also, how long will it take me to do this work? And how do I sharpen my skills there? Then I started my own firm, and I think these last 10,000 hours has been really focused on, now that I understand the tools and the trade, how do I point this at the good that I want to do? And I think that's brought forward with the notion that we dropped consulting and just our next stage. You know, we really see ourselves as a social entrepreneurship company. We see ourselves as having a mission of what we want to accomplish. And we do that in three ways. We do that through client partnerships, which is the consulting work that we've always done. We also have an incubator for emerging nonprofit organizations called Cultivate. That's another kind of program of our organization. We also do thought leadership. We're in the midst of a research project trying to understand employee engagement and employee retention in the nonprofit sector. We see ourselves differently, I think, than what one might think of when they hear the word consultant. I fear that some people have a negative connotation for consultants, the same way that I may like my attorney, but I don't like my lawyer. The lawyer term kind of brings a feeling forward. I think consulting and consultant has also had that connotation, and we try to be something different.
If you do think of yourself as a for-profit social entrepreneurial venture,
Yep.
What is your vision and mission?
Yep. And that's something that has come forward here just in the last, I'd say, year. We have begun to think more globally, even in Mecklenburg County, about the nonprofits that serve us. So I mentioned previously 4,000 nonprofits. What are the classifications of those nonprofits? How do they work collaboratively and on behalf of all of us? So we own all of these nonprofits, just like we, quote unquote, own government. So this government is ours, so are these nonprofits. Now, it's sort of unique that we don't get a say in whether someone starts a nonprofit or not. That is one of the challenges. But the reality is they all belong to us. And so if we are to be empowered as constituents and as residents of Mecklenburg County. What is the right mix of nonprofits for our community? I really see that as the bigger work that Next Stage wants to do, and that my colleague Kaylin Haldeman and I are committed to. We see them in kind of 5 categories. So we have what we call the blue chip nonprofits. Those are those large established organizations. And I should note that this is at least somewhat coming out of a concept that came out of thinking about how we invest in the stock market. So I was thinking through, how do I communicate this kind of complex notion of all these nonprofits belonging to us? And it dawned on me that the 401k is a good example. So we know that the best investment portfolio for a 401k is one that's diversified. And so if we have the best nonprofit community, it's probably one that's also diversified. So we'd have blue chip nonprofits like our blue chip stocks. Those are those large established charities and institutions, typically with very large budgets, very stable, very powerful. Somewhere around 85 to 90% of the financial resources go to the top 150 to 200 nonprofits in Charlotte. So it's where most of the resources live, but they're also regular returns. I can tell you what's going to happen probably over the next year, given some of these organizations, because they've been at it for so long. On the other end of the spectrum would be the founder-led organizations, those emerging organizations. And we see those as, in the stock portfolio, those startup businesses, right? And we need to invest in that in part because there's no R&D function in the nonprofit sector. So if we are to be disrupted, if we are to have new approaches that are going to actually lead to better outcomes, we have to foster an emerging nonprofit community. I hear sometimes, not more nonprofits, we don't need more new nonprofits. And I push back on that the same way I would say we don't need new tech firms, right? We would never say, well, we have Microsoft, so we don't really need these emerging startup tech firms. Of course we do. Of course we need new ideas. But we have to foster the very best. So if in our portfolio, we have to really think who deserves investment, who deserves our time and energy in this community, who are those founders. So if those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum, in the middle we have the niche organization. And that's probably a founder-led organization once upon a time that found its path into maturity of owning its space, an organization that really understands who it is and who it serves and has carved out a niche around what it does. And there's great mid-sized to very large organizations that have a very defined niche in this community, such that if you wanted to start an emerging organization with that same mission, people would say, you're crazy. We already have that in our community. We also have to be bringing in evidence-based imported organizations. So in my stock portfolio, that's foreign stocks. We need to bring in those organizations that have figured it out in another community where the evidence is strong and where there's a gap in our own community. And we have to love on those organizations. We have to invite them in and encourage them, even though they're not from us. Lastly, we have foundations, which are themselves 501c3s, different classification. But they're often the only entity that's investing across that entire portfolio and trying to curate it. And so me as a consulting firm and Next Stage as an entity in this, what's our role in helping foster the healthiest and strongest portfolio? And if we hold ourselves to that standard, the likelihood that you're going to call me up on the phone, find us in the Yellow Pages, and hire us that afternoon, pretty low. We have to do as much due diligence of whether we're spending our time as well as we could. So that's been the big shift for us, and it's only because we've come to a place where the community is empowering us to be this kind of arbiter of a philosophy or a methodology that we're even allowed to do it in the first place. We're very thankful. That's really the standard we have to hold ourselves up to. And that does mean turning down business, or that means not being available for everything that comes along, and in effect having some amount of discernment around our time and how we allocate ourselves. In many ways, that's how our incubator Cultivate came to be, because we saw ourselves spending a lot of time with one type of organization and recognized that there was a more efficient and effective way that we could be working with those organizations.
Let's talk about Cultivate.
Sure.
What is Cultivate?
Cultivate is an idea that came into fruition this year in its pilot year. We found ourselves working with many emerging nonprofits in their first 10 years of existence. Earlier in my career, I felt like those were organizations that drew me in. The founder in particular, as a passionate and vision forward individual, matched my desire to work with organizations that were wanting to take on some of the biggest challenges in our community. And so in the early stages of Next Stage, we found ourselves doing a lot of that work. When Kaylin Haldeman joined our firm as project development manager, she had a very early insight that was very canny, which was that we were doing a lot of training and not a lot of facilitation. So we were going into organizations and sharing out our thoughts and ideas and best practices learned from working with so many organizations and becoming somewhat repetitive. In effect, she was sitting in rooms with me stating the same thing over and over again. And she said, is this the most efficient or effective way that we could do this? What we also saw was maybe 50 or 60% of our time was dominated by those emerging startup organizations. And we saw an opportunity for us to allocate more of our time to organizations that already are arrived in some ways and are at a important inflection point thinking about their next steps. So in effect, bringing forward Cultivate, an incubator and accelerator for emerging nonprofit organizations, was a way for us to become more efficient and effective in how we serve those emerging organizations. This year, we've worked with 3 nonprofits that were selected by a panel of great community minds who came together and helped evaluate some applications that we had received last year. We formed a cohort of nonprofits to work together, founder-led, bring those founders into the room, really seeing them as leaders, that we needed to make an investment of knowledge in them for their current organization and for the decades of impact that they could have on this community coming out of the program. We have a once monthly workshop that is aligned with a 12-month curriculum. So we have a learning management system and a curriculum that we've built with 12 themes. So there's a workshop at the beginning of the month and coaching sessions twice a month for each of the founders, where we work through the themes of the curriculum, but also meet them where they are and try to help them in the things that they're facing in the near term. It all leads up to the creation of a strategic business plan, which is becoming more and more the heart of our work. When we are working with organizations, it's not just that kind of high-level strategic plan that often collects dust because it's not something that can be easily implemented. We get down into the weeds and really see that a roadmap that becomes your business plan, becomes the tactical plan that your board and staff are working with is the key to success.
Who are the nonprofits that are in your current Cultivate class?
We are currently serving 3 organizations. One, Charlotte is Creative, which is the new nonprofit recently announced by Matt Olin and Tim Miner from Creative Mornings. And that organization is bringing together all of their creative pursuits under one umbrella. We're working with Christina Cruz from Promising Pages, a 7-year organization at a turning point, opportunity for them to create a online engagement platform that would help them build their constituency, build buy-in, build donors. And lastly, Learning Help Centers of Charlotte, a faith-based organization working on the east side of Charlotte with immigrant and refugee community and children.
Josh, why do you do this work?
I do think it's an expression of a philosophy, of a road that is laid out in front of me that continues to reveal itself, that in many ways I don't know where this is going. It's scary to admit that. It keeps being refined and defined for me as the time goes on. But it is the most thrilling and fulfilling work of my life. And I feel like each new year, it becomes more thrilling and fulfilling. So I think I'm on the right road. Where it's going continues to be defined. And in many ways, I should take the medicine I prescribe to nonprofits and maybe think about what's my 10-year vision. But I'm happy for the journey that I'm on for now.
Josh, let's talk about how you came to this point and to where you are on your journey.
Sure.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up all over the eastern seaboard. I was born in Pennsylvania and moved to South Florida very early on. My father's job took us all over the eastern seaboard of the United States. Ended up in Rhode Island for a time, out on Long Island, New York. Came back to Florida. So I spent most of my time in Florida, all in, and was eager to leave it, to be perfectly honest. My mother, a lifelong librarian, children's librarian. I was a latchkey kid, dropped off the bus at the library. May not be a surprise that I ended up working at a library in high school. I was a page, always loved books. My mother really fostered a love of reading early on. My father worked in lumber, which normally doesn't mean you move all over the place. Career opportunities brought us to new states. I honestly feel like it was a defining feature of my childhood that I didn't grow up in any one place. It was never any one place for more than 4 or 5 years before moving on. In some ways that helped to foster a hunger and interest in the world that I'd not yet experienced.
How do you think of your childhood?
I think of it as a joyful one. Diverse, certainly. We went from South Florida in the early 80s to the middle of nowhere out on the North Fork of Long Island, where some kids had never left the island in their entire life. So colorful in how many different types of people I met. I always formed a strong bond with my parents, particularly my mother, with my father moving around. As much as we did, he often went ahead of us to establish where we'd be moving. So I formed a strong relationship with my mother. In many ways, felt like I was out of another decade. I was really into the 60s for a long time, I think, because of my mother and kind of listening to the radio. So big Beatles fan, collected vinyl, kind of a nerd in many ways, a little awkward. I think I was a smart kid, but was also the class clown. I think that came forward as time went on, and with each new relocation, I found a new way to sort of process the displacement, and it came forward in this kind of gregarious, very extroverted way. And yet I think at my heart I was an introvert who was trying to compensate. Family has always been really important as a small family. I'm an only child. I have very few cousins, so we were a small family, tight and close-knit. Somewhat of a voracious reader, early imagination. Some of my fondest memories as a kid were creating things. There was a part of me that wanted to be a musician and then an author, and I went through every artistic pursuit early on before settling in that those were probably not things I would be successful in long term. You know, it was a very happy childhood, but a displaced one. So I did spend years as the bullied kid who's new to town. Again, you don't move to Cutchogue, New York, way out on Long Island from somewhere else. No one did. I was the newest kid when I moved in, and 3.5 years later, I was the new kid when I left. But there's almost adaptability that comes with being forced into kind of trying to figure out how to fit in, how to be a part of the fabric of a new community. It certainly came forward when I moved to Charlotte, and I think if I had never done that before, this adapting to Charlotte would have been more difficult.
Josh, you went to Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. Why Flagler College?
We would visit St. Augustine as a family. Living in South Florida, I didn't have much aspiration of going to school outside of Florida for a number of reasons, but the notion that you had to pick between kind of a large state school with 30, 40,000 students or something smaller. I know you attended Rollins. I looked at Stetson. I looked at many of the smaller private institutions before settling on Flagler. I was one of the first graduating classes of International Baccalaureate, which at the time no one knew anything about. So a lot of it came down to who would give me credits. If I went to a state school, I would get a full year going in. But I really didn't want to do college fast. I knew I had growing up to do. Flagler just fit at the time. It's hard for me to disparage any aspect of it. I met my now wife at Flagler. I was given an opportunity to do every aspect of my interests. So I was an actor, I was in main stage plays, I had a radio show, I was on the newspaper. I got to know everybody in the school. It's a big fish, small pond opportunity. Later on, I came to understand the challenges that come with going to a small liberal arts school when I was in New York. Working in New York with Yaleys and Harvard graduates, a little chip on my shoulder developed that, folks don't know about Flagler, and I'd often have to explain where it was. And there's sort of a perception of the academics of schools, of small liberal arts schools. But I would never trade it in. It was a wonderful experience.
What is it that you studied?
I was an English and journalism double major with a business minor. I loved to write. I loved English. Literature was a huge passion. I knew, though, that I probably needed some steeping in business world. But in truth, liberal arts educations are perfect for people like me who don't know quite what they want to do in their lives and aren't quite ready to declare that at age 19. Those kind of collection of majors and minors served me so well. Writing is a big part of anyone in this work. So strong writing, understanding lit crit, understanding how to be critical and look for themes and trends inside of literature, very helpful, and certainly the business side has served me well.
What happened after college?
Well, I had been doing a continuing internship for the Public Affairs Office for Palm Beach County. So all through college, I would return home over the summers and work in the Public Affairs Office, so the public relations arm of county government. I worked in the same building that later on became the Hanging Chad capital of the world. So if you remember a older woman looking at a ballot, her name was Carol Roberts. She was a commissioner. And I had the benefit of being able to work on several campaigns for her through the county government as she wanted to serve on the board of the National Association of Counties, which is a professional association. So I got to, over those summers, go work with her and other communities, got to know someone who now we would call a lobbyist. At the time, intergovernmental relations was the what they called it. And I got to know him, and he hired me out of school to work for him. He had an office in Tallahassee and in West Palm. It was an off-election year, so set about doing the things that lobbying firms do in off-election years, which is basically whatever anyone will pay you to do. So it was an early education in the political sector. I had a moment of clarity about a year into it. I'd done some things that I wasn't particularly proud of, didn't feel met with my values. And so in turn, I went out and ran screaming to the arts and ended up in Jacksonville, Florida with the Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville.
There came a time when you made a big move and moved to New York City.
My roommate at the time in Jacksonville, soon after 9/11, he was from New Jersey, had spent a lot of time in New York. I think anybody who was from the tri-state area needed to go back and see it after 9/11. So we went up in, I want to say it's November. In fact, I know the date, November 3rd. I know it because I stepped off the plane and George Harrison had just died, the guitarist for the Beatles. And I'm a huge Beatles fan. So we went almost straight into Manhattan to Strawberry Fields in Central Park, where some 300 people were gathered singing Beatles songs. And a couple hours later, after singing my heart out, I thought, what am I doing in Jacksonville, Florida? I really need to be in New York City. Fast forward 5 hours later, I'm at a party. I run into someone I knew very tangentially. She said she worked at the Juilliard School. I said, well, are there any jobs there? She said, it's funny you should ask. They're actually hiring. I sent off my resume when I got back to Florida, and just a few months later was moving to New York City.
What did you do at Juilliard?
Well, I was hired to work on the campaign for Juilliard, a $150 million capital campaign that became the campaign for Lincoln Center, the rehab on and facelift that Lincoln Center had early in the 2000s. I was the campaign manager, hired in to help with operations, was there for about $75 million of that $150 million, which was only 2 years. I tell the story of the little woman in Montana up on a mountain who passed away and left her estate to 3 institutions, one of which was the Juilliard School, which she had never visited before. So it wasn't a place to exactly learn best practices of fundraising, but it was a magical place. I mean, obviously Lincoln Center was awe-inspiring backdrop for someone my age who was really in a master's class. I really see that as my time in New York was really my grad school, because I got to sit at the feet of masters in their craft and what they do.
What was living in New York like for you?
It was amazing. As someone who was coming from Florida, I was ready to leave Florida, the kind of planned neighborhoods, the strip malls. I remember landing and moving in, and someone recommended The Power Broker, which is a book Robert Caro wrote about Robert Moses, the builder of New York. And so my first year was actually taking that book and going and walking and seeing all the things that Robert Moses had helped to create. I walked the avenues from Harlem down to Battery Park. I did everything I could, because I wasn't being paid very much, to have a free experience in New York. It opened my mind. It was an amazing place to be. I always say about New York that it gives you the highest highs and the lowest lows. And in those early days, it was the highest highs almost all the time. I floated through the city. As time goes on, the lows start to become lower. And I really believe that somewhere around that kind of year 6, year 7, if you can make it a day, you'll make it a week. If you can make it a week, you'll make it a month. If you can make it a month, you'll make it 3 months. But then a lot of people leave after 3 months. It's sort of an interesting thing. But if you can make it past that, you'll stay a year. And then it goes 2 years, 6 years, 15 years, life. And I was at an inflection point. So interesting. We were at a wedding in Central Park. Mutual friends of ours were getting married. I'd had a pretty tough year and was thinking about making a change in my professional life. Was interviewing and ran into someone I had dated my senior year. She was a junior at the time, and said at the time, it's all in the timing that I was about to graduate. She still had a year left. We had stayed in touch, but then reconnected at this wedding in Central Park. Spent all night together, basically walked the streets, had coffee, laughed, and in the morning I took her into the train to see her out. Again, I should note, we were awake all night walking the streets of New York. And I said goodbye to her, and I knew at that point, as I said goodbye, it wasn't goodbye. So I should note, my wife was living in Charlotte at the time when she came to New York, and I knew that my future would be here. I knew no one here. It was 2007, 2008, so if you can think about kind of what was happening at the time when I decided, I came down on St. Patrick's Day, 2008. Where I was working, Manhattan Theater Club, a Broadway producing theater company, actually offered to keep me on. I guess this had happened more than once, that a professional had moved for a girl and then came back. So they said, you can keep your job. We'll fly you up for opening nights. We'll keep you on the payroll. And I said, no, thank you. I will see you through the end of this fiscal year, but I need to be unencumbered from anything that would bring me back to New York. I knew that this had to be the path. Everyone said, sublet your apartment. I said, no way. If I sublet my apartment, it gives me an easy way back. I'm so glad. Of course, I never doubted my relationship with Adara, but I'm so glad I really kind of had a clean break with New York before coming down here.
You did arrive in Charlotte in 2008 at the beginning of the Great Recession. What was that time like for you?
Scary, but also exciting. I had more or less rejected previous 6 years of my life, and moving down here with no discernible prospects for work. It was a chance to reinvent. It was also scary in so many ways. Charlotte was melting in very palpable ways. There were no jobs. The timing could not have been worse to have stayed on the path as a nonprofit fundraiser. In many ways, it was the best outcome I could have hoped for, because it helped me find consulting. I worked for a couple consulting firms in those early days that helped me learn that this is even an option, that this is work that people do, that it's meaningful, that someone will pay you to come in and be a potential change agent for that organization. So I'm thankful that there weren't easy answers when I first arrived, but it was definitely a reinvention. I had a very almost kismet touched experience. Everywhere I went, it just seems like things had worked out. And this was the first time I'd really hit a wall. So it was definitely career defining, but also personally defining.
What did you learn about yourself?
Well, I learned that I could gamble on myself, that I could bet on myself, that I wasn't a expression of my job title, but instead a living, breathing person that had goals and aspirations. So the idea of that career reinvention and recognizing that it can work out if you believe in yourself, those things can work out. It's going to take a lot of work. And I think that's what I've most learned as a consultant is work ethic. I work so much more now than I ever did back when I was a practitioner for a nonprofit. So I found and awakened inside myself a desire to work hard. I think that's been the most defining characteristic of my last 10 years.
There's this phrase I'm sure you're familiar with, those who can do, those who can't teach. Do you think it's also true for consultants, those that can do and those who can't consult?
Yeah, this is a constant thought I have. So I think it's about knowing your gifts and knowing what you're good at. You know, I've served on the boards of organizations. I've been practitioners inside of organizations. And I serve the nonprofit community best as a consultant, meaning that the change I can make, the strength I can bring, the perspective, and frankly, the position as a third-party facilitator and thinker is best suited to who I am. Now, I also feel that there is something missing, and that's part of my journey with the mission of Next Stage is how can I do this work in a way that is most closely aligned with the idea of having a mission, the idea that I'm more than the sum of the parts. There's an outcome I'm trying to work toward. So that's been a big journey. I mean, that's been the 10 years of this work has been how to do it in a way that's authentic and true to who I am.
I would also say that teaching and consulting is doing.
Right. Well, good. That's even a better answer. Exactly. I mean, you're doing the role that you're supposed to do and where your gifts lie in helping move along the progress of our community.
Josh, you've had forks in the road. You've had epiphanies. You've reinvented yourself. How does that journey inform the work that you're doing? How does it help you be a better partner to your clients?
Well, it's hugely defining. It's wayfinding in many ways. I need to be a grounded person as I work with organizations that are often not as grounded. If I'm uncertain of myself, I'm a poor facilitator. I'm a poor deliverer of the value proposition that I bring forward. So this journey I've been on is about strengthening my confidence and my belief in myself and our firm, in Kaylin as my colleague, that we are a net add to our community. And so this pathway that's taken us here has been all about strengthening, which is really what we bring as a message to organizations, that you're never a complete organization. You always have to be strengthening. You always have to be thinking about the future. So I would say that the journey here has been about building that confidence and building the capacity to do the work that I'm called to do. The way forward will be how to continue strengthening and continue adapting to a changing community.
Josh, when you are not at work, what are some of your interests and hobbies?
Well, I hate to admit it, but I'm a huge fan of craft beer. It's become probably my number one hobby, collecting and consuming craft beer. I love the whole craft movement. I really feel like it's a symbol of what we're craving, which is better connectivity with our local community. To know that this beer is created by a local artisan craft brewer, someone I can know, someone I can shake their hand, I can like them on Facebook, I can dialogue with them. In many ways, it's not just the beer, but kind of what it stands for. That said, I also love the taste of beer. So basically name it, and I'm a fan of it.
Artisanal citizenship.
I actually love it, artisanal citizenship. Well, this notion of a curated community that is made up of people. I'm a staunch humanist. I believe strongly that it's our belief in our greater goodness as people that will get us through all of this. And if we don't have close connection with each other, there's a missing piece to who we are. So in that way, I think artisanal citizenship is a great term that it would maybe even define me personally.
Josh, when you look into the mirror, what are you winning at?
Well, I'm winning in my relationship with my wife. Hopefully my wife is next to me as I'm looking in the mirror. I feel like I'm winning with this pathway that I'm on toward discernment of my role in the world. I have to hope that that's where this is leading, is that greater clarity about what I'm supposed to be here to do, that I am finding meaning in my life, which is, of course, why I love this podcast and on Life and Meaning, because I really feel like that pathway that keeps unfolding in front of me has great riches of insight and closeness and connection with people.
Thank you for your time today, Josh.
You got it. Thank you, sir.
Josh Jacobson is managing partner of Next Stage. He earned a bachelor's degree in English and journalism from Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. And now, a personal word. Josh Jacobson and I could very well be the same person. Well, at least we've had very similar influences in our lives. Josh shared these defining features of his life. He was an only child, loved by his parents. He moved frequently from one place to another. He felt displaced, always the new kid in school, learning to adjust, developing his social skills with the broad gestures that teenagers learn to do. He was privately sensitive and introspective. I can hear him listening to the Beatles, because the Beatles were smart and complex, and love is all you need. These are the traits of someone who would be drawn to the liberal arts, to asking foundational questions about the meaning of things, to seeing connections across disciplines, to seeking patterns of cause and effect, to leading a life of service. Josh went to Flagler College, where he flourished. I can imagine him making an impression in class, acting on stage, writing for the campus newspaper. I can imagine his voice and command of language, faculty and administrators turning to him for his thoughts, the college presenting him with opportunities, the college recognizing him as a star. After graduation, what to do then with those qualities? How might he contribute to community? How might he flourish again? Josh worked in intergovernmental affairs in the state capital of Tallahassee, which meant lobbying politicians, which meant the toss and tumble of compromise. The worst of human impulses can show themselves, lying in greed when profit and politics mix. Josh failed forward to the arts, to expression and making the world a better place, first in Jacksonville, and then under the bright lights of New York City. I can see him singing in strawberry fields in Central Park 2 months after the towers fell on 9/11. I can imagine him saying this is where he belonged, ready to launch his career, ready to create a new city arising from the ashes. Josh walked the streets of Manhattan, from Harlem to Battery Park, experiencing the highest highs, that in the center of all things he would make his mark. There is this attraction to possibility, to the hero's journey of entering a special land. I can see Josh crossing thresholds, encountering marvels, and also confronting fears. For in a special land, we confront the depths of our psyche. We can fall into the abyss. We can experience a death of ego. If we come through the ordeal, we are transformed, resurrected, awake to our gifts, rewarded for being who we truly are. Josh gained the insight to leave New York and the love of the woman who would become his wife. Josh came to Charlotte, ready to share what he learned, his elixir, with residents of a new land. When Josh arrived in Charlotte, knowing no one other than his bride-to-be, a new quest began, a new calling, new mentors, new trials, new triumphs. The cycle of adventure and discernment repeats. He pushed forward in self-development. He is a work in progress. Humanity is a work in progress. Facing ourselves is the most terrifying and difficult thing we do, but the only way for us to live in a meaningful and positive way. Josh Jacobson and I could very well be the same person. Well, at least we've had very similar influences in our lives. I am one of 5 children, the last one in the lot, loved by my parents. I carry that with me, this profound sense that their love protects and ennobles me. Our family moved from country to country, from state to state, from city to city. I was never in the same school for very long. I learned how to be social, but was privately sensitive and introspective. I loved the Beatles, first Paul, then John, then George. I went to Rollins College, where I flourished. After college, it was a journey to flourish again. I pursued professions, only to feel compromised. I moved to new cities, seeking adventure. I experienced the highest highs and some pretty bad days in my career and relationships. I have listened for calling. I have been rewarded with the most wonderful marriage and friends. I hope the place I'm in is a bit more of an extraordinary land for me having lived in it. Josh knows he is on a journey. This is what I sense about Josh. He knows in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.